Welcome to Beyond the Walls podcast. I'm your host, Kylie, and I am so excited to be able to have this conversation with you to help teach you tools, ideas, support on how to go beyond your walls too. Are you tired of feeling stuck and trapped and like a victim in your own life? Maybe you need to find a new way to look at it. Look at your situation from a different angle. Maybe we need to learn and take a look to see how we can re-choose or recreate a life that is going to bring you joy and purpose and feel free and exciting. So let's get started on today's message. Back to the podcast, y'all. I have a really potentially challenging conversation that I want to have with you guys today, but definitely a very beneficial one. And no matter where you are at on the spectrum of this conversation, I think one of the big takeaways that I want us to all talk about is really just how do we cope with our pain? And pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And there are so many decisions that we make in our life to heal in a healthy way, or we choose to avoid it. And a great guest with me today, her name is Wendy Hack, and she has an amazing story and has gone through so many ups and downs. And so I'm just going to hand it over to you, Wendy. You can tell us your story, and then we can kind of get into what you're doing about it today and go from there. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Kylie. I grew up in Minnesota, and in some ways, we all come from some kind of dysfunction, right? But my father was an alcoholic. He had a significant problem with rage as well. So I grew up pretty anxious, pretty insecure. I did try to do what I could to rectify the situation. I sat my father down when I was 12 years old and told him I thought he was an alcoholic, and he said, "That's none of your business." And so at that point, I felt pretty helpless and powerless to change the situation. And I started getting involved with drugs and alcohol myself when I was about 15. And then when I was 16, I was sexually assaulted. And then I really dove into drugs and alcohol quite a lot. By the time I was a senior in high school, there were days I was getting high 4 times a day. And then when I went off to college, it got worse. And then that spring break, actually, I had this really bad experience where I was bored. So I went to a liquor store, bought a quart of liquor, went to a movie. I stumbled out of the theater, got into my car, drove around rip-roaring drunk, crashed into a snowbank, got out of the car and laid in the snow, and these 3 gentlemen from the house right by there carried me into their basement. The police came by and said I was listed as a fugitive because the keys were still in the ignition. The quart was in the car, so they were supposing that I had driven drunk. And they lied to the police. And then after the police left, they took turns raping me as I went in and out of consciousness. And a lot of people ask me, is that when you hit bottom? And the answer is absolutely not.
Wow.
Because I saw alcohol as getting me through all the pain in my life. I didn't see that alcohol was causing all the pain in my life. And that's like a huge difference.
Wow.
So after that, I experienced more drugs and alcohol, but I started to have a spiritual desire for help. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to go. Got down on my knees and just prayed, I'm miserable. I will do anything. Please help me. So there was definitely a point of surrender. And I met some folks who were able to help me in my relationship with God. And that was monumental for me.
Wow.
I didn't use anything for about a year, but I immediately transferred all of those addictive tendencies then
Mm,
toward my relationship with food, because you
mm,
can't stop eating, right? You're
yeah.
still have to eat. And so I became obsessed about food, and that was a real struggle for me. And I kind of, after a year, rationalized that now that I was right with God, that I could drink like everybody else.
Mm,
So I would drink on a holiday or on a date, uh, justifying that it was a special occasion. But what was going on in my mind was this mental obsession. I would sit there and at the dinner table and say, well, I can have one drink every hour. And so then I can have two drinks with dinner, and after dinner coffee
mm,
drink, that's normal. That's okay. Not realizing that social drinkers don't think that way.
mm,
And that went on for some time until I ended up moving to New York, and a friend made some observations about how I kind of was a walking chameleon.
mm,
And I had found out about this chemical recovery program down in New York City. And what's interesting is I moved down to New York City to participate in this program. And the week that I moved down there, I went to a Chinese restaurant with a friend. And the fortune in my fortune cookie said, sometimes travel to new places can lead to great transformation.
mm,
Yep. And that definitely proved to be true, because when I went through the program, what you do is you write a journal of every time you ever use drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, anything mood altering, and then what happened, what were the negative consequences, and then how did you feel about those consequences
mm.
from the first time to the last time, just all of it. So
Wow.
I wrote and wrote and wrote for 16 hours.
Mm,
And the first time I did this, I read this to the group. And I don't know about anybody else out there, but I happen to love Pink Floyd, right? And one of my favorite albums is The Wall. And, you know, I love the ending of The Wall, where it's just kind of like he's built up this wall around himself. And
mm,
isn't that what we do? For my behavior, I made a lot of excuses. I glamorized my use. I laughed about it, made it funny,
mm.
things that really weren't funny. But
Yeah.
when I wrote that journal and I read it to the group, it was kind of like, tear down the wall,
Wow.
tear down the wall. And when I got vulnerable about some of the most humiliating things I've ever done, and I was loved in return unconditionally, that
Mm,
was amazing for me.
mm,
It was transformational because I could be who I really was, which
mm,
was an alcoholic, and
mm.
still be loved and still
Yeah.
be okay.
Mm. Wow. I don't even know where to begin. That was on I have no words, right, for the things that you have gone through. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I know for people listening, right, like clearly you've had a lot of recovery and healing in a way that you can talk about it so like pragmatically, right? But clearly not minimizing in any way probably all of the pain and the hurt that came along with that story. And I have one question that I was thinking about was, where was your mom? Did you have a mom growing up?
I did. And it was interesting because I think as a kid, I felt like, why isn't mom doing something? You know,
Hmm.
why is it up to me to be what I felt like was the parent here?
Yeah.
And actually, last year I did do some therapy, And I felt like the reason why I wanted to go through some therapy is that I felt I still had shame. And so
Mm,
I thought that some of that shame had to do with some of the more embarrassing things that I've done, but actually, it really went back to my family of origin and
mm,
specifically my mom. Like,
mm,
because my mom, she wanted everything to be perfect.
mm,
She wanted me to be perfect. She wanted to have the perfect family. So it was all about looks.
mm,
We had to look to the outside world like we had it all together. But
yeah.
behind closed doors, it was anything but. And that was a very frustrating situation for me. So I realized that I had a lot of anger towards my mom.
Mm,
And God bless her, we got together and I was able to share some of those things with her and
mm,
resolve some of those differences. And
yeah.
that was amazing. It really was because um, my mother, she didn't want to hurt me, but I think she didn't know what to do either,
Yeah.
just to
I would
stop the
imagine.
chaos. Yeah.
Yeah. So then does that mean that everyone in your world didn't know, like all of the things that you did in your teen years, like the drug use and the drinking, like was that in secret? Did people in the world know, but not your family? Or did your mom know and she just put on a good front for the public?
Well, I would say it's kind of a combination of things. I was a very good student. It was interesting because probably about 10 years ago, we got together with some family friends, and there was one guy who I knew from high school who was married to another person from my high school who I hadn't seen in years. And after I left, this woman said to my sister, "Oh, that Wendy, she was such a goody goody in high school." And her husband said, "What are you talking about? She was a drug addict. Our pastor's son was her drug dealer." And so this was this couple, and they each had a different view of me because I was one way in school, but then I was one totally different person when I was away from that. So there
Yeah.
was just, it was kind of like my upbringing, like hyper 2.0, you know what I'm saying? Because I was so used to learning how to look good, but my mother, she she would find me out about things. She didn't
Mm,
know the full extent for
yeah.
sure, but she knew that I was into stuff.
Wow. Well, and I would imagine, I mean, so correct me if I'm wrong, but if she's obviously married to your dad who's an alcoholic, she probably felt just as powerful. I mean, she couldn't fix or change him. So I would imagine she just only knew how to do damage control with you. Like she didn't have what she needed to help with your dad. And so if you're kind of in those same kind of habits, I don't, she did the best she could. I think that is such
Yeah,
a healthy healing space when we can go back and kind of forgive our parents for who they were and who they weren't, right? Like
right, right.
it does say more about her and what she could or couldn't do as opposed to whether you were valuable or not. But it's so confusing when we're kids. Like it's so confusing
Mhm.
because so much of the world, and even now, right? Like we're always using these external situations to prove that we're valuable or we're not valuable, and so
Right.
it's so unfair to ourselves and to others, right? Because we're so quick to just condemn and to fear, all of that shame and the hiding. It tracks even when you were saying, right, like your friend who called you a chameleon later on, like
Mhm.
so much of how you had to do that. And I can hear in that even, I mean, I have some sexual abuse and different things like that, and more just relating to even just the shame and the fear of just needing to look good on the outside. And so I was too afraid to get involved in anything. And so fear prevented me from getting into mess. But still the same amount of shame or just being insecure and feeling like
Mhm.
you're putting on this front for people, right? So I think even if people, no
Mhm.
matter where people are at on the spectrum, we can still relate to that feeling. And even the the feeling of being able to not fear the condemnation of being in the dark. I think that was something that, I really connected with in your story, where you're on the other end, where you're sharing the journal, like all of the skeletons are out of the closet, and
Uh-huh.
there's nothing to be a chameleon about anymore. To risk acceptance on the other end, to really be accepted for who we actually are, is so healing. It,
Uh-huh.
I can speak for myself of being able to connect with that. And then that challenge, right, to keep being willing to face the openness and integrity of honesty and not hiding in that fear is so powerful.
Right.
So I'm curious too, in your story, at what point, because a lot of conversations that we've had, and I talked a lot in one of my earlier episodes, if anybody wants to go back and listen to it, like, um, I spoke up within about a year. It was like a close family friend, um, that he was like 5 years older than me, like an adult child kind of inappropriate situation. But we ended up, for lots of different reasons, we ended up having to go to court, and there was he got put on the sex offender list and all kinds of like big stuff, right? So I'm a big advocate of like speaking up and speaking out and just getting help, or at least just not heal. Like, I didn't know in the moment what was going to be the outcome, and wasn't necessarily advocating to do that, but at least just being able to share with others and not suffer alone in silence. Um, so I guess, at what point in your journey was it when you became a Christian? Did you ever like go through and kind of process all of those things, or did it not really get addressed until your journal time with the CR program?
Well, I think initially, I mean, I poured out to some women from church my whole, need, the things that I was into. But
Mhm.
as far as the nitty-gritty details, like I came to a conclusion, you know what? I need God. I need help. This is what I've been doing. I was very honest about things, but
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily share, 25 pages of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
It was more like, yes, I did this. Yes, I did that. Yes, I did. So, but you know what? It was all, I think, for me, part of that plan, because I think if I had to face all of this stuff, all of this shame, all of this guilt, the self hatred that I had, if I had to do that all at one time, I think at the very beginning, I would have fled.
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
don't think I would have had the courage to deal with it all. So
Yeah.
as I went along, it wasn't until 8 years later that I participated in this chemical recovery program. And
Mhm.
by that point, I had matured some,
Yeah.
and that was really helpful. But one thing that you said, Kylie, that I think was instrumental for me is you mentioned connection.
Mm.
And connection, you know, being known for all the, and getting all that stuff out, and that unconditional love and acceptance. I was connecting with other people who also came from similar backgrounds than me. But
Mhm.
I also feel quite strongly, that we all have stuff.
Yeah.
It might not be as extreme as
Yeah.
what I went through, but it doesn't matter because we live in a very broken world. Uh, we can be very broken people,
Yeah.
even without extreme circumstances in our past.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. Well, and I think too, I think what I heard in your story, that is, I would imagine, so you can tell me the answer to this, but I'll assume that, that initial transformation of being able to really know God and to accept his love, right? Like, to really see our need for him and to start to let our identity be in him and to heal some of those wounds. Like, hearing in your story, like 8 years later, you needed another major transformation, right? Like, you were ready for healing at a deeper level. And I think that that is super valuable, I think, for all of us to know that, like, it it doesn't undo any of the growth that was made before. It doesn't make it, like, I think sometimes we're so quick to then want to doubt what was, or somehow God wasn't working all this time when we need to level up, right? Or we need to, like, just be more vulnerable and to face the shame. We need more forgiveness or to forgive other people. But you can see that, like, so much grace and patience for you to be healed at the right time, at the right pace for you, right?
Yes,
Like, God does
absolutely.
not give up on us. Like, if I don't learn this lesson now, like, this were some of my prayers. I'm like, God, let me learn as much as I can right now. But I know for sure that you're not going to give up on me, and I'll get another chance, right? Like, if I didn't understand it to the degree that I needed to, or I'm going to get as much as I can handle out of, like, protection and safety for me of, like, what we can handle at that time. You had matured enough to be able to go deeper and to have healed to the degree that you did. So you want to speak to any of that, or was that accurate?
Yeah, I think all along the way, up until that 8 years when I really got in touch with a lot of this pain, there were definitely healing moments for me. I think
Mm.
specifically this one time I was listening to a Gordon Ferguson, love Gordon Ferguson, tape, and he was talking about how God feels about us. And he
Mm.
said, um, I have this watch. And he said, would anybody give me $10,000 for this watch?
Mm.
He's like, any takers? 8,000? No takers? He's like, no, because you wouldn't pay for something more than what it was worth.
Mm.
And he said, Jesus' death on the cross established how much he was willing to go through. That established our worth. And the
Mm.
first time that I heard that,
Mm.
I lost it. It was so healing to me to
Yeah.
know that, God had that kind of unconditional love for me too.
Yeah, that is powerful. Hear what you're saying, like, it is so valuable when we can just connect with really and accepting the worthiness, right? Like, accepting that love. I would imagine, was there any, like, parts of your story that were harder to connect with, or did you feel like it was so clear of, like, what the root problem was, that, or, like, did any particular part of the story hang on to you harder than another one?
Well, I went through a sexual abuse workshop,
Okay.
um, and that was really powerful for me because I think there's something when it comes to sexual abuse, there's such a shame factor. You can think, for me, I thought, it's all my fault. It's my fault.
Mm.
And that's why I didn't tell anybody, because I couldn't stand to have somebody else tell me, it's your fault.
Mm.
Even though it's like, okay, when I was 16, I was naive. I put myself in a risky situation, but I still didn't deserve to be sexually assaulted,
Yeah.
you know? And
Yeah.
was I really drunk and out of control? And when those guys carried me in their house? Absolutely. Was that my choice? Nobody put a gun to my head and told me to go buy a quart of liquor. That part I
Yeah.
have to take responsibility for. But the
Yeah.
part that I didn't have to take responsibility for, it wasn't right for those men to take advantage of me the way
Yeah.
that they did. That was
Yeah.
wrong. And
Yeah.
so, like, going through the sexual abuse workshop helped me to address the big question of where was God in all of this, right?
Mm. Mm.
And so God was where he always is, which is in the light. God is in the light. His ideal will is that people treat one another well. You know,
Yeah.
he doesn't want people to mistreat one another, but
Yeah.
yet he is calling us to the light. And,
Yeah.
you know, when we're in darkness, there's a lot of things that are going to happen. A lot of times, just even in walking in the light, there's things that happen.
Yeah.
But God is always wanting there to be healing, there to be peace, love, joy, all of those good things. That's who God is. And
Yeah.
so it's trusting that God created people with free will so that we could choose to have a relationship with him or not.
Yeah.
But that free will, that can also, you know, be used to hurt other people. I like this illustration, which is you can use an axe. Now an axe is made for chopping wood, but you could
Mm-hmm.
also chop someone's head off with it, right?
Yeah.
So God, who made the axe, he made it for a good purpose,
Yeah.
right? But he still created us with free will. And that's what I had a big problem with God about. I was like, why
Mm.
didn't you make us all robots? I'd
Yeah.
rather that we all be robots and not hurt one another.
Yeah.
But that's not what God chose to do, because God wants a relationship with us that involves two people choosing each other. Because that's
Yeah.
what we do when we choose to have relationships with people.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a beautiful analogy. I like that. Do a lot of work with um just helping people and counseling and um doing those things. How did you maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work that you do, and did you start off on that path early on, or at what point did that happen? What were you doing before you started in that kind of work, or did you already set out off on that kind of path?
So once I went through chemical recovery, I was in Mike and Brenda Leatherwood's group, and they led CR in our faith community. And they were amazing people. And I really wanted to be able to do what they were doing with other people. And so I was trained to lead. And then I moved back to Minnesota and started up my first CR group. And I led CR off and on for about 25 years.
Wow.
And I still continue to help people on more of an individual basis
Yeah.
rather than a larger group setting. But when I went through school as an adult later on, after I got out, I worked as a writer for several recovery type organizations.
Mm.
We produced a whole lot of magazines for treatment centers, and I was an editor and a writer of those. And then I also worked for a website called The Influence, which had 1 million hits in 2016 about drug and alcohol recovery news and
Wow.
information. So I wrote a lot of articles for them and edited and things like that. I worked
Mm.
for Hazelden for a while,
Mm.
and then I worked for a nonprofit, um, just learning how to be a better human being, which was
Mm.
great. And then
Yeah.
recently I joined up with the Minnesota Recovery Connection, and that is has to do with peer recovery services. So
Mm.
it's really walking alongside people in early recovery, or maybe they're just getting out of prison or homelessness, or
Yeah.
um, but have substance use issues. And it's wonderful because I'm on the phone with people mostly, sometimes in person, but I'm doing all the things that I was doing as a volunteer now
Mm-hmm.
in a paid capacity, which
Mm.
I just like have to pinch myself like, oh, this is so great. I love this, and
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind of what I'm doing vocationally.
Yeah. Wow. What did you go to college? I think you said you went to college, right?
Hmm.
What did you go to college for? What did you want to be a writer early on?
It took me a while actually to figure out what I wanted to do.
Okay.
I started off in music. I am a piano player. I'm also a piano teacher as well as a writer and a grant writer and peer services person, which I love. And I've been doing that for over 20 years as well. Just love working with the kids that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I graduated college back in 2011 with
Yeah.
an English degree. So I finally figured out what I wanted to do, and yeah, now
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
That's so cool. Wow.
Hmm.
Talk about most with people, whether they're in the paths of these organizations that you're working with, or just friends and family that aren't in CR or don't need, like they're
Hmm.
not, that wasn't their um,
Hmm.
drug of choice
Right. Yep.
mechanism. Like, what would you say is something that either advice you give them or what you see as a common
Hmm.
hardship?
Well, I feel like, we all have our stuff. We all have our stuff, and we all have emotional pain. And like I'm saying, it doesn't have to be extreme. It can be something like boredom or emptiness. Um, you just feel frustrated. And
Mm,
we tend to use inanimate objects to deal with that pain, like
mhm,
it could be drugs or alcohol, but it also could be shopping or food or sleep, or
mm,
I'm going to numb out and just be on my phone all the time. We all have these tendencies to use inanimate objects. And when we do that, we do tend to feel guilty, shame, negative feelings about ourselves.
yeah.
And it's just kind of a perpetual, round and round we go with emotional pain and how we deal with that. So God didn't create us to deal with pain by using inanimate objects. What he
Mm,
would like us to do instead is to have that connection both with God and with other people. And so, like, what I try to explain is it's like, even though I've been sober for 28 years now, it doesn't mean I'm never tempted. I
mm,
might be frustrated with something. Usually it's with one of my adult children. And then I, pass by our refrigerator downstairs and something taps me on the shoulder and says, "You could drink. No one would know."
mm.
And I just say in my head back, you know what? God would know and I would know, and that's enough. And alcohol
Wow.
is going to make things feel better for about a minute, and then it's going to make everything worse. So why
Yeah.
would I want to do that? But then I go and talk to somebody about it. And
Mm,
I tell my husband, like, I was just tempted to drink. And he'll say, "Well, what's going on with you? Why did you feel that way?"
mm.
And we talk about it. And
Yeah.
then when you're talking about your frustration and you're talking about the emotions that are going on underneath, it's
Yeah.
like then you get that connection with other people that feels so satisfying, and it brings you a sense of peace and joy. And I really feel like that's the way that God intends for us to deal with that emotional pain, as well as going to God himself.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Beautiful of what I just heard was like, yeah, your willingness to then come in the light, right? And I think the second we come into the light, it loses that power of just being able to share like the temptation. And there's no shame, or it sounds like you and your husband have a dynamic where he's not then like upset with, it's not about the drinking. It's not about the temptation, but it was about what triggered the temptation, right? And to immediately be able to go into that kind of conversation, I wonder what advice would you have um, for the tempted, I guess outside of just that's your example for those that get
Mhm.
tempted to share that. But then as the helper, how do we both grow towards that? If people listening right now recognize themselves that either, man, they're having to support somebody in their life that's being tempted in all of these different ways to cope in an unhealthy way. So maybe speak to us a little bit about that, of like something practical we could put into practice.
Well, I think it's really important that when we all feel like we have some safe people to share things with. Um, I myself, wherever I go, I really try very, very hard not to be some kind of chameleon anymore. But there's some people that I feel more safe with than
Yeah.
others. And my husband is amazing. Like, he is so accepting, he's so reassuring, but he's very honest as well. And so he'll be very gentle and, very accepting. But I totally realize there's a lot of women out there who don't have that even with their husband. He might not be that safe person, but to find somebody, to
Yeah.
find somebody who's safe, that they
Yeah.
feel like they can be accepted and not judged or shamed because of what they're going through or how they're feeling.
Yeah.
And how can we be that way for each other? I think sometimes we feel like we have to, if somebody shares something painful, that we have to immediately relate. Oh, well, I feel that way too, because da 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 da, and that's not necessarily true. We just have to be there for each other and listen and say, gosh, that sounds so hard. And I feel so sad, that you're going through this. And I
Yeah.
really want to be here for support for you. And so
Yeah.
that's how I feel like we can be there for each other, is not judging or shaming or telling people what to do, but just
Yeah.
listening.
Yeah. Yeah. What advice would you have for the person who, like, I guess I'm thinking even more specifically, you could use like your mom and dad, for example, maybe, but like when you're in a relationship with someone who is an addict who doesn't want to deal with it, that you're not unsafe, right? Like, so if it's a hope, I don't know, and then maybe that's a conversation in of itself. When is it safe? When is it not? When is it healthy? When is it not? Right? Like, and it's confusing, right? Of like, how do we have healthy boundaries while sort of respecting the people in our lives, especially when you're dealing with adults? Like, do you want to get well? What do you do with the people that aren't ready to get well yet, or they don't want to get well, versus the one that does want to get well? Do you have anything to
Right.
speak to that?
Yeah, it's about years ago, I used to think it was about confrontation, and it's not.
Mhm.
It's not, because people are on their own particular journey. And even though you might see some ways about their lives that they could be healthier, they might not be ready to go there yet.
Mm,
So, what you can do is, in listening to them and supporting them, I bet you there's times where they don't feel so great about the things that they're doing. And maybe they say, gosh, I wish I hadn't gotten drunk last night, and snapped at the kids, and I feel
mm,
bad about it. And what you can do is you can then affirm I hear you. I
yeah.
hear that you want some change in your life. How do you think you can go about achieving that? Is there anything that you can think of that you could do that would support you getting more healthy? Um,
Mm,
and to kind of come alongside someone rather than, you know, um, confrontation or something like that. But
yeah.
I do also think if somebody's not even doing that, and they're just acting out, and they're blaming all of their use on other things, or maybe that person, maybe their spouse, they're blaming it on them, or they're blaming it on their job, or they're blaming other people why they can't change or why they don't want to change, or just leave me alone.
Mhm.
There are things you can do to help bring up that person's bottom. Like,
Okay.
for instance, let's say you're going to go to a family get together and your husband is driving your family car and you go to the family gathering. You can talk about beforehand, if you drink too much, I'm going to take the car home and you can find your own way home.
Mm.
And so you're giving that person a negative consequence, when they've done something
Mm.
without, and really all you're doing is you're taking care of yourself, right? And you can say that to them. Listen, you can choose to do what you want to do, but for me, it's not safe to get in the car with you after you've had too much to drink, and I'm
Mm.
not going to do it anymore. And
Wow.
so I'm going to take care of me. I'm going to take care of the kids by doing something that's safe.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other piece of it, is talking about yourself and like how you feel, how you're going to handle things. That's
Mhm.
the boundary setting part of things,
Mhm.
is how am I going to take care of myself in this situation? And
Yeah.
totally admitting, listen, I have no control over you. You
Yeah.
can choose to do what you want to do.
Yeah.
This is about me. And
Mm.
and that's I guess the advice I would give.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, can you speak a little more to I remember when we were chatting before and you were sharing about kind of just the relatability in the way that we cope, like of just coping with pain in general. Maybe let's speak a little bit more on that. I think you talked a little bit about it. But you were even kind of just sharing like an interesting eye opener between like the social drinker and the alcoholic, right? Like in their differences and realizing like just how we're the same. Like we can all relate in some way. It doesn't show up the same way, but we can relate to one another. I'm gonna call.
So I I I have this analogy that I like, that compares social drinkers to uh, non-social drinkers, let's call them, uh,
Okay, good.
and how I feel like they relate with one another. So God has created things in a cause and effect kind of way.
Mm,
So like if we're little, we go up, we touch a hot stove, and we burn ourselves. We learn, I don't touch a hot stove, and this is normal.
mm,
But what an addict does is they go up, they touch the hot stove, and they burn themselves, but they also get some numbing relief in their head. And so
mm,
they keep going back to the stove, touching it over and over and getting more and more pain in their life. A social drinker looks on and says, "That's crazy. Why do you keep doing that? It's causing so much pain to your life."
yeah.
But the addict is like, "But see, that's become my central way to cope with
Mm,
life. I can't imagine coping without it." And so
mm,
there's this impasse that social drinkers and non-social drinkers have with one another. Like I still don't understand social drinking. I don't get it. I don't
mm,
understand why you would drink alcohol if not for the effect. And
mm,
so there's this impasse between us. The thing is so often what happens is a social drinker will look on at an alcoholic and heap judgment on them because
mm,
it is crazy behavior, right?
yeah,
I mean, it's crazy if we keep doing that.
yeah.
So what's so important is helping that individual get in touch with the pain of their using. For me, it was that journal, that just jammed my hand down on that stovetop until I felt that pain that
Mm,
using was causing. And it was like, "Oh, yeah, this is crazy. I don't want to do this anymore. It's
yeah.
causing me pain." And that's
Mm,
what keeps me sober. But I will say that everybody has stuff. Everybody. Everybody copes in a certain kind of way. And so
yeah.
it's looking at that.
Yeah.
Where do I see that in my life? For me, it's mood altering substances, but for somebody else, it could be something else. And
Yeah.
so then it's just examining, like, where do I do that? Like, I recently got to know somebody who, her son is on the autism spectrum, and he's nonverbal, and she cares for him a good deal. He's an adult now, and
Yeah.
it's a really frustrating situation a lot of times.
Mm,
And I just asked her, like, how do you cope, you
mm,
know, with that situation, and we kind of went over that list, that you go through in the Bible of different coping mechanisms that aren't
mm,
healthy, that aren't right,
yeah.
and she picked out a few of them, and they're different from how I would have coped with a situation. But
Yeah.
it's kind of like talking about, like, okay, yeah, I guess that's not a healthy way to cope with it. How
Yeah.
can I deal with it in a more godly way instead? And that produces all kinds of good fruit in your life.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that because I think that it helps us to stop. There's the passage about like the plank and the speck, right? And it's almost like, it's almost like talking about that, right? Like, oh, well, you cope in such a horrible. I can't believe that's how you cope, right? While we're at the same time coping in our own, right? I was thinking of, yeah, either with food or alcohol or shopping, spending, right? Like just the way we take care of our lives, our house, maybe even codependency relationships, right? Or just vegging out, like you said. It made me think of I did an episode about self-care. And I think so many times, like I think what's promoted on social media and advertising and marketing is self-indulgence,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's this escape. Like, and when we're doing self-indulgence, that's when we come back with the shame and the regret. Like we're never proud of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is happy the next day when they woke up and they stayed up too long watching Instagram, right? Like, or TikTok
Mm-hmm.
videos or just watching movies. Like, nobody thinks back and like, oh, that was a really good day, right? Like, sure, if you were sick, like there is a time and a place and a time frame when it was a good thing to do. And there's totally nothing wrong with it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's something I've been trying to understand for myself of like, when am I doing something to escape,
Mm-hmm.
avoid, not deal with, right? Versus like, I'm actually going to go do this because I need rest or I need care or I need something,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like that's going to actually help me feel better later.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does totally come back to that connection that somehow it
Mm-hmm.
has to be connected with somebody where
Mm-hmm.
it's not shame based and we're not fearing their judgment or just we're wanting to be healthy, right? Like we're wanting to
Mm-hmm.
feel at peace and reminded that we're loved and secure, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to assuming we're not. Let's just keep going in the dark. Let's just
Mm-hmm.
double down in the dark. And that's so
Mm-hmm.
hard. But I appreciate that language, even just for all of us to be able to think through, like, how do we all do, we do something. We all naturally cope in a particular way that is not healthy. Like, I don't think any of us naturally, right? It's kind of in that choice with God, right? Like, we have the choice to do it his way or our way. And so what are
Mm-hmm.
we doing to cope?
Mm-hmm.
Is it healthy? Is it not healthy?
Yeah,
And just,
there was an ICU nurse that I knew quite well, and she was dealing with the COVID situation.
mm,
And, people in her unit, every day, she was dealing with death every
mm,
day
yeah.
and doing everything that she could to prevent it. And I said, how did you decompress from something like that? And she said, I would just come home. I'd go into my sunroom. It was beautiful nature that I like to look at, the scriptures, and sleep. And I
Mm,
thought, isn't that a beautiful picture of what real, genuine self care
mm,
looks like? You know, I love what you're saying. There's a difference between self indulgence and self care. I get confused about that still. because
Yeah.
I didn't know how to really care for myself. For me, it looks like when I play the piano, that's healing. When I cuddle with my dog, you saw a
Mm,
picture of my dog.
mhm.
She's a little cockapoo and she's so cuddly and affectionate and everything.
Yeah.
Um, my husband and I love to make each other laugh. We're
Mhm.
constantly trying to outdo one another in that way.
Yeah.
We love to play cards. We're addicted to this Brazilian game named Baracco. So there's lots of different ways, like, that I think I try to feed my soul on a regular basis,
Yeah.
because especially when you're in a helping profession,
Mm,
if you're not a real strong um, advocate of self-care, you can
yeah.
get compassion fatigue,
Yeah.
quite easily, and get drawn onto other people's roller coaster.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. And I think that was probably even part of the questions I was asking earlier, that I think sometimes, I've got a teen daughter. We're all like, I'm trying to start this business. My husband's got his business. Like there's just everyday life stress, right? That just, we're all on ups and downs. And then we have all of our friends and we want to stay connected, but being connected means we got to cope with our own pain. We're also impacted by other people's pain. And like, man, how do we can't be all things for all people and just cope. I love that language. Like, I feel like that will become a part of my everyday language of even just maybe even asking people, instead of asking them, how are they doing? How are they coping? Like, because I think it somehow just changes the conversation and it implies that life is hard, right? Which I think is helpful to just normalize. Like, it's not just always good and bad, like and we can have good moments and bad moments at the same time. I think that can feel hard too. And so if we're coping, how are we coping with whatever is coming in? Because I suppose even coping to celebrate, like, how do we choose to celebrate might even be something to consider. Or do we celebrate in healthy ways that's actually nurturing to us and life giving versus creating that pain or avoiding pain? That's a lot.
Yep.
Well, as we wind down here, any last thoughts or things you think we need to talk about, or you would want to leave anybody who might be struggling on any end of any spectrum of this?
Well, I think just in enjoying life is something that I do on a regular basis now. And I think just, if there's anyone out there who feels just a loss of hope, I
Mm,
guess I would just want to speak to that person and say, there's so much hope. There's so
mm,
much hope. There is a light at the end of the tunnel. Reach out to someone, talk to someone, reach out to Kylie. You
yeah,
know, um, there's just, I think that God wants us to experience healing, love, peace, joy, like just all those things that make God who he is.
yeah,
And we have hope no
yeah,
matter what. And we have hope in how we cope.
yeah, yeah. And it's never too late, right, to learn a new way to cope.
hmm
I guess.
hmm Right, right.
Well, and I think so. Before we forget, I believe you wrote a book. Can you tell us about it a little bit? And so people want to hear more about your story and can really connect and relate. Where
Sure.
can they get it? What's it called?
Yes. It's called Broken into One Piece, and peace is spelled Peace. And
Mm,
it's available from Outskirts Press. You can just go to outskirtspress.com, go to their bookstore. It's written under the pen name Susanna Hua, Qa, and I did that to protect some family members in there because there is
yay.
some pretty raw,
Mm,
pretty real stuff in there. So that's
yeah.
that's why I chose to write it under a pen name.
Oh, wow. Well, I'll put that in the show notes as well,
Mhm.
for people to go and find. And I'm so grateful for this time to be able to have this conversation and being able to just share the hope and to share survival stories, right? Of people going beyond their walls and it not being the end. And I'm so grateful and I'm inspired by just the journey that you've been on to not be that chameleon anymore and to just be in the light. And I appreciate too, even just sharing how you shared how like temptation is just going to be a part of the rest of your life, right? Like there doesn't have to be all this shame as if the goal is to never be tempted again. And then there's something wrong with you for being tempted or having to wrestle, and every step of the way, just choosing to be in the light and to have safe people around you and have that connection. So what a powerful story that you have. So thank you so much for sharing it with us today.
Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. All right, everybody, have a great day and check out the show notes. Go get yourself a copy. Bye.
Thank you for joining me today. I hope that brought you a lot of encouragement and some information to be able to apply to your own life and to start taking down those walls that are in your way. What is that one thing that you want to take on and take with you today? I would love to hear from you and to hear about it. Follow me here on the podcast so that you're alerted and don't miss any upcoming episodes. You can find me on Instagram or even on my website at beyondthewallspodcast.com. If you want more help, I offer one-on-one coaching and would love to connect with you. Until next time, have a great day.